Right. In this video, we're going to start talking about the taste for discrimination. So we're going to talk about a model which is the early model in economics to look at discrimination. This has come up with Gary Becker came up with this in the 1950s, and his goal was to try to bring race and discrimination into a way that economics could consider it in the existing economic models. Okay, and so his idea was that some people may have a taste for discrimination, so they have a you can think of this kind of like a prejudice or something like this that then becomes actionable, right? So there's three potential sources of prejudice that might cause discrimination. So one is the discrimination could come from the employers, right? So it could be the employers have a prejudice towards a certain group and therefore it affects their interactions with them. It could come from the employees, so the workers themselves have a prejudice of some sort, which then affects their ability, their willingness to work with this group. And finally, it could come from the customers. The customers could have a preference about who they want to serve them, and that could then affect the hiring practices of the companies. So in each case, we can think the discriminator has a taste for discrimination, and the kind of tricky part is that then this can be measured in monetary terms. So let's go ahead with the first one of the employer type. So employer discrimination works like this. If the employer is the source of the discrimination, it works like this. So basically, you can think of them as having a utility function, and their utility function has two parts. So normally we would just have profits, right? So we had our profits here. Normally we just have profits. So they like profits. Firms like profits. Owners of firms like profits. So that's normally all we think they would care about. So they get utility from these profits. That's why it has a positive in this. It means they get satisfaction or they like it. But now there's a second part. There's also a dislike group. So there's group that they don't really like, or they don't like, actually, I should say, and this group enters negatively for them. So that means hiring this group is going to affect this employer psychologically. They're going to feel bad about hiring them. So we can say they don't like the dislike group, and it's a psychological cost to employing them. So to the employer, the wage for the dislike group feels like this. So the wage feels like this. So let's suppose we're talking about women here, for example. So then the wage for female feels as if they're paying that wage plus this extra thing, and this extra thing is called the psychic cost. Okay, and then this one, this W star here is we can say this is what the wage feels like. And not W prime, I guess I wrote. This is what the wage feels like. So it feels like they're paying them more because not only they pay them money, but they have this psychological cost to hiring this group. So D is known as the discrimination coefficient. It's a measurement of how discriminatory the person is. And the larger D, the more prejudiced the employer is. Okay, so if D is really large, the employer really, really dislikes this group, and if it's small, then they just have a slight preference, you can say. Okay, so this is it seems a little contrived probably, but it's a way to fit in discrimination into affecting people's wages. Okay, so now let's do some predictions. So what's going to happen when everybody wants to discriminate, but they all want to discriminate the same? Okay, that's our first thing. And the second thing is, what should happen if it's not the same for all firms? Meaning some firms have a bigger, they want to discriminate more, and other firms want to discriminate more, and other firms don't want to discriminate at all. And how will competition play into that part? Okay, so let's take a look at this. So if every firm, D greater than 0 means the firms want to discriminate, and it's the same for all firms. So they all want to discriminate the same amount. Then it's clear the market's going to favor the liked group. So in the case of one way we set it up, that would be men. The way the original paper was, the original theory that he came up with was comparing blacks and whites. So in that case, the white group would be the beneficiary and the black group would be the dislike group in that case. So it ends up being that the prediction of this is that the women will be paid less, okay, or the dislike group in general will be paid less. We can move this to the other side. We can move the D to the other side. Sorry about that. And so we're going to say, well, they're going to make less, so they're going to be paid less, and also it's going to be harder. It's the other prediction of this. It's going to be harder to get jobs if you can't pay less. We can say if you can't less. So you can imagine back 1950s, factories deciding who to hire, and the factory owners all have a prejudice, and then uh, they they will only hire black workers if they can pay them less, right? So that's kind of the prediction of this idea. Now, one thing comes in, the Equal Pay Act says that people have to be paid the same. So once the Equal Pay Act comes in, actually that could increase unemployment for a group who is the recipient of this prejudice because the firms won't be able to pay them less. They would like to, but they won't be able to pay them less. So anyways, that would actually make that would predict it would become harder for that group to find jobs. All right. So let's now look at the last part. What if the different employers have different levels of discrimination? This is where there's a little bit of issues with this model. Um, it predicts that the employer with no prejudice, okay, so you have some employers with no prejudice. Let's put them here. Let's see, let's highlight them. Okay, so we have employers with no prejudice. We have employers with no prejudice here. And then we have D greater than 0 for other firms. So this model would seem to think, if you remember back to microeconomics, it would seem to think it would be an advantage to hire the cheaper workers. So remember in this model, for example, in 1950s, African American workers would be significantly cheaper because they're being discriminated against. So they're being discriminated against, which is pushing their wages down. So then those who don't want to have prejudice will hire the group, which is the dislike group, because they're cheaper. Right? And they should be able to focus, if they're focused on profit maximizing, they should be able to make a profit by doing this. So this is kind of a criticism of this model because in fact, we saw maybe to some extent, but we did not see that so much going on. So the basic theory would be that less discriminating employees should have a competitive advantage in the long run. In a competitive market, they'll drive the discriminating employers out of business because they're essentially hurting their bottom line by discriminating in that viewpoint. If you view it this way, they're hurting their bottom line by discriminating because they're turning away workers who are capable and productive in favor of other workers who are equally productive but more expensive. Okay, and so that would be the idea of it. So we would expect in a competitive market, if people enter and are not discriminating, that it will benefit them and that they will drive the other ones out of business. And maybe in the long run, we've seen that. In the short run, back at that time, we did not see that without the help of laws to limit the behavior, the discriminatory behavior of the firms. Now, in a monopolistic market, we could see the firms continue to discriminate because they can sort of afford to. They don't have competition. So if a firm is in a monopolistic type market, has quite a bit of market power, it could continue to discriminate, and that could push it out. Now, so anyways, the basic prediction is that we'll see more discrimination going on in places where there's monopolies or firms with significant market power. And we might also see that the group that's being discriminated against will be more likely to be found in competitive markets and the preferred group might be more likely to be found in markets where there's monopolies or more market power. And that's just because those things that are those firms in those markets can sort of afford to do the discrimination even if it hurts their bottom line.